And we will leave like another 2-3 minutes for more people to join. The recording has started.
Are you in Greece this
Yes.
morning? This afternoon?
Yeah, in Athens.
And how is life in Athens?
Good.
Such a busy city.
It is a very busy city, but I don't know. I like Athens a lot. I've moved around Europe and stuff, but I chose Athens. And you've been traveling a lot. Of course, you will tell us where you're based and stuff in a minute when we start, but.
Sure. Yeah, I was in Austin, Texas, and then Seattle, and then Cleveland, Ohio in this last couple of weeks. Inside the States. Yeah.
So it's good traveling.
Yeah, I was going to say I don't know if I shared this before, but I was in Athens years ago. This was when I was married, so with my then wife, and we went to Santorini, which is, of course, quite beautiful.
Yeah, beautiful island. Very busy as well. Okay, so we will start. I'll do the introduction, and we will start little by little sharing content, and we'll see, how many more are joining in the minutes that follow. So I'd like to welcome you to this free workshop that Sophia offers together with ThoughtStretchers. The title of the event is Teacher Wellbeing Using Inquiry to Grow an Intellectually Nourishing Community, and it's part of our overall commitment to work with various forms and shapes in promoting well-being in school environments this year. Sophia does a number of activities to raise awareness on the fact that well-being should be at the forefront of educational systems. And when we say well-being, we definitely mean the well-being of teachers and students alike. So we are organizing a number of events that will follow in this period, 23-24, that would provide capacity development to educators and school leaders in order to strengthen the well-being of their staff, of their educational staff, but also their students. One major event that we are putting together and is happening on November 15, 2023 is Bridge the Gap 2023. For those of you who follow the organization, you know very well that Bridge the Gap is our big event. It happens every November, and every November focuses on a different topic. This year, Bridge the Gap is revolving around well-being. The subtitle would be Prioritizing Teachers and Students' Well-being, and it brings together a panel of experts that will speak about the experiences and the research they have accumulated through the years on the topic, referring to the global educational community and pinpointing the differences that each context entails. And then it will contain a roundtable discussion as well, where teachers and school principals and students will share very personal opinions and very personal experiences on what they have encountered in their environments and how they have faced challenges in the past. So without further ado, I will welcome again all of you. I will leave in the chat the registration form for Bridge the Gap 2023 and pass the floor to lovely Drew Perkins, who will speak to us about himself and the organization. I'm sure that all of you are very curious to find out what ThoughtStretchers do. And then right into the content of this workshop. Thank you very much for joining. Drew, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm looking forward to sharing some of those things that you mentioned. I know we had, I think you said like 25 or 30 that had registered. I'm not seeing that number there. Are there some that I'm not seeing that are in the room here?
We have people joining like progressively in the event, so we'll be waiting for more people to come later or see the recording afterwards.
Okay. Well, hopefully we'll have some others that will be able to join, because some of the things that I'd planned certainly require some interaction, and without those folks being here to interact, it'll be hard to do that. But yeah, I'm happy to be with you all, and those of you who might be joining afterwards and watching afterwards. So if you can see my screen, you'll see my name and of course some ways to reach me. Our organization is called ThoughtStretchers Education. The work that we do is primarily professional development, professional learning, and we used to be called Teach Thought Professional Development. We've recently undergone a name change for a few reasons, but we are still certainly connected in a friendly way with Teach Thought, which is the organization. You can find it at teachthought.com, but you can find our work and our blog pieces and our professional development pieces and our podcast that I'll talk about here in a moment at wegrowteachers.com, which is at the bottom of the slide there. My email address, of course, is drew@thoughtstretchers.org. And if you are on social media, at the artist formerly known as Twitter, I think they call it X now officially, that's my handle. All the work that we do is through the lens of inquiry, and a lot of it is project-based learning work, some differentiated instruction work for sure, a lot of inquiry specific work. I worked with several schools in the last few weeks on inquiry specifically, but again, project-based learning is the main area of work that we've done over the years. And we also have lots of blog pieces and other resources on that website as well. One of the things that I do get the pleasure to do is to host our podcast. And if you are interested in podcasts, you can find it by searching ThoughtStretchers Education Podcast. As you can see, they're meant to be heterodox conversations to stretch your thinking about important issues in education. So really trying to use and leverage that inquiry stance and that curiosity to have conversations with all kinds of different people on all kinds of different topics. Sometimes pushing back and playing devil's advocate and really trying to get into the complexity and nuance of things, as opposed to just being sort of solely a promotional vehicle. So most people listen on Apple Podcasts. So if you search for ThoughtStretchers Education Podcast, you'll find it there. If you go to our website, which again is wegrowteachers.com, you'll see a piece or a part in our menu that will direct you to the podcast. And of course, you can listen to it in lots of different places and subscribe wherever you listen. A bit about me. My name again is Drew Perkins, and I was a teacher for 15 years. I really tried hard not to be a teacher because my mom was a teacher and my grandmother was a teacher, and felt like that was not a job that was going to be well suited for me for a number of reasons. So my intent was to become an attorney, and I went to school here in the States. I'm based now in Louisville, Kentucky, if you're familiar with the States, but I went to Michigan State University and I was in school to become an attorney. I was a political science major, and I interned with an attorney and realized that was not my calling and did not want to do that. So I tried to decide what I wanted to do and moved around a bit. And my older brother was in Houston, Texas, so I moved down with him. And at one point, I substitute taught in an elementary classroom. And while I was quite terrified to do that as I was walking in the classroom, I realized I enjoyed it. So I went back to school and got my teaching certificate and taught mostly social studies. I was here in the States, you're certified for secondary social studies, or secondary usually, or elementary. And so like middle school and high school here in the States, all of the social studies courses. But initially, I actually was working in special education with emotional and behavior disorder students and that kind of thing until I was able to find a regular classroom job. But that special education work, certainly I learned a lot of classroom management and certainly a lot of learning in those sometimes very, very difficult settings. What I then, like I said, I've moved around a bit. I've taught in Michigan and then in Louisville, Kentucky, then out to a place called Napa, California, that lots of folks might know because it's quite a beautiful tourist place. And then came back to Kentucky, where I taught at a high school from 2001 to 2012. 2012, I left classroom and was doing some consulting work for an organization. It used to be called the Buck Institute for Education, but is now called PBL Works. And I was working with them to do their PBL 101 workshops, which I enjoyed. And part of that, I really, really enjoyed working with really smart people. And when we would get together, one of the things that I want to talk about today is the importance of intellectual nourishment and how that really, really felt empowering and exciting and sort of profound and propelled me forward professionally. And unfortunately, I wasn't getting that in my classroom and in my educational setting as a teacher. And so that's something that I want to touch on here. But I'll touch on that a little bit later. As I shifted out of the classroom, I began working with an organization here in Louisville, Kentucky called the Collaborative for Teaching and Learning. I designed a project-based learning model for them, did some other work for them, and then shifted out of there and began in 2016, which was Teach Thought Professional Development, now ThoughtStretchers Education. And again, we do all kinds of work. Most of it is project-based learning and differentiated instruction and inquiry, but we do lots of different things. Everything is like I said, sort of focused through the lens of inquiry. When I talk about myself and talk about my history, of course, I can't leave out my two daughters who are 14 and 16, and my oldest now having her driver's license, and the bittersweet I guess, feeling of watching them drive off to school on their own and not needing me as much anymore, but that's a good thing in many ways. I also sometimes like to share here a poster or pictures of some things that are hanging here in my office, which are my grandmother's teaching certificate. So proof that I do come from a long line of educators. And if you probably may not be able to see it, she was certified in English, French, chemistry, biology, social studies, and then they added home economics. And then this is also hanging her teacher's contract, which in Erie, Pennsylvania, in the United States here, she was a teacher in 1933-34, and this was her teaching contract, which for which she earned $960 US, which is not very much if you understand the value of the dollar now. And usually starting teachers are probably somewhere 30, 40,000, or certainly up sometimes depending on the setting and the place. But also, interestingly enough, and this was not uncommon here in the States, she was subject to a couple different, I guess, rules, one of which was that she could be fired for a change in name, which would be marriage, and a change in condition, which would be pregnancy. So I always joke that seems like a terrible human resources policy, but what do we know? Those are things that are hopefully bygone, and folks have more, I guess, autonomy and rights and those kinds of things. So let's kind of get into some of the pieces here. I know we have, I think, a fairly small group that is in the room. So this may not hit and take as much time as I'd hoped with longer groups, but when we work with schools and really focus on the inquiry pieces, it's helpful for me to ask some questions to kind of get a sense of who's in the room and what those things are, or what the answers to these kinds of questions are. So I'm curious, even from the small group here, I should be able to use the chat box to answer these questions, like what are some of the best things about the school where you work, and what makes success challenging, and what does your school and your work struggle with, what helps you do your work better, and how do you know you're doing well? So again, for some of those folks that are in the room, if you don't mind dropping into the chat box some thoughts that these questions might be generating. We have such a small group, it may not be, we may not have a whole lot here, huh? Somebody's typing here. That is a name that I can't even begin to pronounce because that's an, I'm
it's
assuming.
Chrysanthi.
Okay.
Like gold flowers.
Okay. I think she's typing. Thank you, Natasha, for putting that link to the podcast in the chat box.
Sure, sure. And we will leave it for those who will see the recording. We will leave it in the description of this workshop for other people to see it as well.
Yeah. Expecting values. Yeah, good. Looks like somebody else is joining. I'll try to pronounce this correctly. It's Srilatha. If you just joined, if you're seeing the screen, you should. What I've asked folks to do is to respond to the questions that are on the screen, just to try to get a sense of where you are in your education and your work. Cooperation. Okay, good. Well, I'm going to move us on because, like I said, I was hoping we'd have a larger group that was present. Smiling faces are always good. And sounds like if I'm understanding correctly, folks can just talk and are unmuted, or if they're unmuted. I want to get into some of the things when we're talking about this workshop, thinking about well-being and intellectual nourishment and inquiry, to kind of unpack this. So what do we mean by teacher well-being? And I'm curious for any of you, if you're willing to just kind of talk about that, and if you want to unmute and just mention, like, when you think about well-being, what are some of the things that the words that pop to mind? What are the things? And I know that the work with this, I guess, conference, for lack of a better term here, is really focusing on that. So I'm curious what everybody thinks about and how you would define teacher well-being.
So Drew, if I can initiate that discussion.
Yeah.
This is something that it is very, very important to define what we mean well-being, because it might mean different things in different minds, and in different areas around the world, I guess. To my mind, teacher well-being has to do a lot with operating in a free and stress-free environment. So stress is a very important factor that, in my mind, affects the well-being of teachers, and their ability to do their work, day by day in an effective way. So I see stress as something that influences them as personalities and the work that they actually deliver as well.
Okay, great, thank you.
Chrysanthi.
Okay, nice being here. Thank you. So for us, for everybody, I think it's recognition and appreciation, because when you're recognized, when you're feeling valued, then that is something really important. And I see that every day with our colleagues. And also very important is to work in a positive school environment. So, that goes with each kind of, with every kind of profession. I mean, when you've got something that is supportive, that is positive, then in that way you can influence the well-being. So mostly the culture and the climate of the school or your working environment can affect the overall happiness.
Okay, thank you for that. Anybody else want to chime in? And maybe another way to ask this is, what would the evidence be that teachers are, I suppose, experiencing or in a good or healthy state of well-being?
Maybe nowadays retention is a key, is an evidence. Like when teachers remain, and that, as Chrysanthi said, and I agree with her a lot. If we have an environment like the one she described, teachers will stay in this environment for working for longer. So for me, every time I go to school and I see that teachers have been working there for 10, 15, 20, 25 years, that this is an evidence that their well-being is protected in that environment, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, I think that does make sense. Looks like Srilatha decided to head out. Is it Mapia?
I think it's Maria.
Maria? Okay. Silently lurking in the background. Yeah, so I do think, we think about emotional well-being and emotional health, social emotional skills and health, those things really being important. So is a teacher being able to, in a sort of supportive and in an environment, a culture and climate that will help them do the best work that they can. One of the blog pieces that I wrote some time ago is that we should make it easier for teachers to do great work and not harder. And there are lots of reasons and lots of things that get in the way of teachers being able to do great work. Sometimes teachers get in their own way, but certainly lots of different factors at play. So we want teachers to be able to do the best work that they possibly can. So creating the situations and scenarios and environments and culture and climate that will help them do that, I think, is obviously very, very important. So then related, when you think about the term intellectual nourishment, and it's something that I've sort of introduced here, what does that bring to mind? How would you think, well, what are the things that would describe intellectual nourishment, or what are the things that come to your mind when you first heard that term?
Has to do with intellectual development, maybe.
Okay. Intellectual development. The little icon here at the bottom being a brain eating. And so, like, what are the things that might be brain food? Some of that certainly is around professional development and around pedagogy and teaching practice and best practices and those kinds of things, no doubt. But there's also, I think, a real place for creating that culture using inquiry and using the all kinds of different inquiry exercises and activities that may even be not necessarily about pedagogy and practice and those kinds of things. So creating that sort of culture where the water in which we swim involves lots of, shall we say, lots of questions, lots of inquiry, lots of wonder, lots of curiosity, all of those kinds of things that I think foster that sense of intellectual nourishment. And I will tell you, I mentioned it earlier. So in my 15 years in the classroom, I had varied degrees of that. When I was working in California, for example, traveling, meditation, exploring new hobbies. Yeah, okay, thank you for that. When I was working in California, one thing that I really, really enjoyed, and I think gets to some of this intellectual nourishment, was that we had a longer and extended period of time for lunches. In the middle school, the middle school grades, we had an hour, and the students would, of course, stay on campus, and they would eat, and then they would have some sort of recess and time to play and socialize and that kind of thing. But that gave us as teachers like a full hour, which is somewhat unusual in lots of states here and lots of schools around the United States, because our lunches tend to be very compressed. But lunches are a really wonderful time to have really organic conversation with colleagues that are not staff meetings, that are not professional learning community meetings, or those kinds of things, which are valuable, of course, but being able to make some of those connections, and in some ways, sort of, as people would say, break bread and have collegial, friendly conversations with folks you work with, I think is a really, really important piece. At the high school level, we also had an hour. Students could go off campus for lunch, and we would usually eat in our departments. So social studies and history and those kinds of teachers, we would eat together and be able to have lots of really interesting and useful conversations. And then I moved back to Kentucky, where I mentioned I taught from 2001 to 2012, and I think we had 24 minutes for lunch, and very, very, packed in. We would try to have lunch together as a sort of department, or some of the teachers that we knew together, but it was obviously very, very short, very jam-packed, not very stress reducing, not a lot of time for recognition and valued and hearing each other. Those kinds of things are really, really difficult in those settings. So one thing that I really advocate for, wish schools could do and should do, is to have longer lunches where colleagues can have some of that sort of organic back and forth outside of just the pieces of best practice and looking at test data and those kinds of things. So I definitely think those are important pieces. So we do a lot of work, as I said, around inquiry. As I mentioned, I was working in schools over the last few weeks around creating a culture of inquiry, creating a culture of thinkers. We have a workshop that we call Creating a Culture of Inquiry. And I do think that one of the things that is certainly connected is a sense of community. So when we build that sense of community in, one of the things that you all have mentioned is the sort of recognition and valued and being heard. And I think it's really, really a wonderful way to address and think about how we can help our colleagues and help each other, help as professionals become a bit more connected personally. Doesn't mean they have to be best of friends. Doesn't mean that they have to agree on everything, but that sense of curiosity that can be fostered. And we want that in students. At least I think we do. We want to foster that. We want to leverage that. I'm going to talk a bit about how we can do that with students, but I think as adults, we want to model that, not just so that our students see it, but that we get some practice in doing it, because we're thinking about how we do that with our students as well. But also, I do think it has a real benefit to the sort of intellectual nourishment piece. I'm going to try to play a very short video clip here. One of my favorite, we do a lot of work in the space of sort of depolarization. We have lots of polarized politics and culture war kinds of things here. And one of my favorite groups is a group called Braver Angels, and they do lots of grassroots depolarization. One of my favorite people doing that is Monica Guzman, and she did a TED Talk, if you're familiar with those. Just want to play a very short clip about that. Hopefully it'll play just fine here. That I think sort of illustrates the importance and the power of curiosity and inquiry.
Sorry, Drew, I will interrupt because we cannot hear the audio of the video. You will have to share the screen, including the audio. There is a button When you go and share the screen, there's a little button that says,
So I need to go to, do I need to stop sharing?
yes, please. And then you
Okay.
go to share again. And just below the top
I also share
toggle,
tab audio.
you see.
Yeah, so sorry.
Sorry for that.
Yeah, no, thank you for letting me know. So audience window. Well, it says also share tab audio. I might try it again. Are you seeing the screen again?
Yes, yes.
Okay, let's try it again.
Curiosity
Yes.
busts through the reality distortion fields that are blinding us to each other for one beautiful reason. Every human being wants to be seen. I've been a journalist for 15 years, and I've only recently realized that most of my thousands of interviews are something many of us crave and few of us encounter. Conversations focused on understanding without judgment. People say that listening is about paying attention, being present. And these things are critical to good listening, but they're not what listening is about. Listening is about showing people they matter. And the way you show people they matter is by aiming your curiosity at them. Ask yourself, what kinds of people do I talk about but never with? Whoever is underrepresented in your life will be overrepresented in your imagination.
So again, I really appreciate her work and her message. She's got a wonderful book. If you're interested, it's titled "I Never Thought of It That Way." And as a matter of fact, she just yesterday launched a podcast called A Braver Way podcast that is certainly worth listening to. That's obviously, well, maybe not so obviously, it is focused on some of the depolarization pieces here in the United States, but I think the lessons and the curiosity that she displays is sort of universal, if that makes sense. So let's talk a bit about inquiry. When we work with schools with inquiry, and again, I think these things have parallels to how adults will or should think about inquiry and interacting with one another in a professional setting. We think about the distinction between inquiry being intentional and intuitive. So intentional being a bit more, someone might say, the science of teaching. So the lesson planning, the design, the architecture of a unit or a lesson. What are the things that you want to put in, and how do you want to structure and scaffold and assess the work that you're doing with students in a way that is very intentional and having that sort of roadmap all planned out. And then the other is being intuitive, which is maybe more easily described as like the art of teaching. So the ability to know when to sort of push in, pull back a little bit, ask a question, pose a statement and ask them to consider it, those kinds of things, where that's, again, sort of a mindset. It's maybe an inquiry stance, and being able to sort of develop that mindset and that stance, and then use that in your work with students. But of course, here thinking about how you do that with your colleagues, and having those opportunities and for school leaders to set up opportunities that are both intentional and maybe a bit structured, but also sometimes organic, like I mentioned, sort of lunches, where you are really curious about other people and where you're asking those questions, some of those things intentionally set up, but then sometimes it's just the way that we work. It's the water in which we swim. And that would be something more like the intuitive piece. So if you think about the intentional piece, we always want to think about the scaffolding and the work that we do. And we want to think about, should I use inquiry? Is it fit for inquiry? How much inquiry experience do the students have? What is the ultimate goal of the lesson? And so based on some of the research and the work that I've been able to look at and talk with folks on our podcast, this is based on the work of a researcher in Denmark. His name is Ard Lazander. And I was lucky enough to have him on the podcast several, I don't know, probably a couple months ago now. The other folks that are certainly worth paying attention to, John Hattie, a lot of folks may know, other researchers as well, Daniel Willingham, and those kinds of folks. But thinking about really being really clear what it is you're trying to accomplish. I love how John Hattie talks about teaching with intent. And so what are you trying to accomplish? Are you trying to teach, multiplication facts, or are you trying to teach and get them to think about something a bit more big and abstract? And so we want to scaffold those things. Surface deepen transfer is one way to think about that. Are you looking at the surface knowledge and trying to build that, because that is important? And inquiry may not necessarily be the most effective and efficient way to do that. But when we get to those deep and transfer pieces, of course, we want to include some inquiry and collaborative exercises and activities. You also want to think about how much experience with inquiry do your students have. Here it talks about table 1, where we think about how do we differentiate the inquiry experience. Again, this is based on the work of Ard Lazander and some of his other colleagues. But thinking about the ways in which we want to sort of guide and differentiate inquiry for students, and using that as a tool. Again, these are sort of the intentional inquiry kinds of things that I mentioned earlier. And then what's the ultimate goal, right? What is it that we want them to do? What's the best tool to do that? And sometimes inquiry is not necessarily the best tool. We want to teach with intent, right? So identify those academic outcomes we're after, identify and scaffold for those surface, deep, and transfer learning pieces, make sure we're building informative and summative assessments, and identify the cognitive complexity and prior academic achievement. So those are some of the sort of intentional inquiry pieces that I was trying to sort of unpack there. When we think about the intuitive pieces, they tend to be more, again, sort of the art of teaching, and one might say facilitative questions. So this is Ron Richhart, Power of Thinking, Making Thinking Visible. He's got a new book that I'm supposed to be getting soon, and he'll be back on the podcast to talk about it, hopefully very soon. But I love this idea of this sort of facilitative questioning, of trying to not only get what's in our head as teachers out to students, but the idea of getting what's in students' heads out to us so that we can reinforce it, correct it, or build on it. And so various versions of this bottom question, which is, what makes you say that? And when we're talking and working with colleagues, are there opportunities? Are there places, whether it's around practice, whether it's just sort of more organic conversation, to use that kind of question to say, that's interesting. What makes you say that? Or as Monica Guzman might say, I never thought of it that way. Kind of tell me more. And so we really think that inquiry stance and those inquiry opportunities can really help in building the community and building that teacher well-being, because certainly we say, well, how do you notice somebody's thoughts? Well, how do you sort of recognize their value? How do you recognize their ideas as being valuable, even if you might disagree with them? And of course, not all conversations are going to be sort of high stakes and something that you might disagree heavily about. But being able to notice and say, well, that's a really interesting perspective or idea or question, or those kinds of things that I think can be really powerful in helping people sort of feel valued and feel that recognition and feel that culture and climate that allows for that kind of discussion. And again, practicing those inquiry skills that will help us with students, I think is a big piece of it. So one more thing to think about, I think, that is important is the sort of things that get in the way of questioning. And this is certainly true with students, right? That sort of culture of fear or the apathy, like I don't care, ignorance, I don't really know enough to ask good questions. And that certainly is a reality in our classrooms. Do we have the time, and do we have the culture? I think these apply to adults and teacher well-being as well, right? Do we have a culture where it's okay in staff meetings and department meetings and or more organic situations where we do have that sense that it's okay to ask some questions. Matter of fact, it will help that process. We really advocate for using sort of a PBL kind of approach, project-based learning approach, where we're using a driving question and asking need to know questions and using that inquiry process to democratize and get those voices of staff out in the room, not just saying, I'm the school leader, here's what's going to happen. That again can help with some of the sort of number 5 pieces of the culture and climate, because that fear starts to sort of dissipate and those voices become part of a valued conversation. Again, the culture, I think, is part of 1 through 4 relate heavily to the culture and apathy. Do you care about the work that you're doing? I think this is really important with students, but it's also obviously really important with teachers. If teachers are burned out, if they really don't care about the work that they're doing, and I honestly got to a point towards the end of my time in the classroom where I felt like that was the case. I was like, I'm ready to come in, do my job, and as soon as I could leave, I would leave. And that's not a very healthy place to live or be. So we want to foster, and I actively sought out opportunities to have some of these kinds of questions and these kinds of deeper conversations. But that apathy piece is a really strong piece to fight. The ignorance piece, again, with students is really powerful. Sometimes teachers may not know enough about a certain thing to ask questions. Time is obviously an issue. How do you structure and how do you build in time into your work and into your classroom or into your work days in a very, obviously very, very busy, schools are busy. We've got all kinds of things going on. There's so much that is on our plate, and trying to carve out time to maybe go slow so you can go fast kind of thing. That's a real challenge, no doubt, for school leaders. So we also do work in the area of social emotional learning with students. And one of the things you may notice here is the mindset of inquiry and compassion, right? So these other things, obviously, we think are very important, but as you think about, and this is a blog piece, if you want to look it up on wegrowteachers.com, you can find the blog piece, but we really want to foster this mindset of inquiry and compassion. Can you do that with your teachers and your staff and have these kinds of conversations that might be about practice? They might not be. Right? Can you have these things that are sort of intellectually stimulating and intellectually nourishing happening in your classroom, in your school, and then your staff meetings, those kinds of things that will help foster this sort of teacher well-being. So I'm going to stop for a moment and see if there are any questions or any comments. Anybody wants to add anything to the conversation with like I said, a question or a comment. And this will be the awkward teacher wait time. Feel free to either put things into the chat box or if you'd like to unmute. Okay. Well, a couple things that I'd like to do with the time remaining here. One is to introduce an exercise that we do with our workshops and that we advocate for with our with work with teachers with students and things that they can do in the classroom. This is called the question formulation technique. It was developed by the Right Question Institute. If you want to read more about it, you can obviously go to their website. Make Just One Change is a book that is really a great resource to sort of unpack the ways in which the QFT can work and how to develop a good question focus. Essentially, this is a question generation tool, and there are some steps. We won't do all of the steps here because we don't have a large group of folks in the room here. We probably won't have a lot of questions generated. But basically, the idea, again, is to ask as many questions as we can. I'm going to provide you a question focus, and usually that's a statement. we're not going to stop and discuss and judge or answer and we're going to write down every question exactly as stated if we were standing around a chart paper or a whiteboard. Usually when we do this in our workshops, or if we see done with students, they'll be standing at a whiteboard or lots of times a chart paper with markers and just sort of dumping their questions in. Once in a while, you'll see somebody scribing. And so those last 2 bullet points are kind of directed at that. We want to have that scribe write them down exactly as stated or change them, any statements, into a question. There might be some light conversation as people are sort of sharing their thinking, but there's not deep conversation because we're really just trying to generate questions. So again, we don't have a lot of folks here present in the room, but the question focus that I came up with here is this statement, and lots of times the statements are meant to be a bit provocative. So if the question focus is where is, it should be, I'm sorry for the typo, where there is a clear set of bona fide best practices, they must be used and used well if one is to be called a professional educator. So when you consider that statement, and again, sorry for the typo, should be where there is a clear set of bona fide best practices, they must be used and used well if one is to be called a professional educator. A QFT process would be to just generate questions. So if you'd like to add any questions in the chat box, please do so. I see a question here. Could you please repeat the question generator tool? I can put that in here. Question formulation technique. And it's at the rightquestioninstitute.org. I think I can probably pull up their website and put it in the chat box as well. So again, looking at this question focus, if you think about best practices, and you say, well, best practices must be used and used well if we're going to be calling people professional educators. What questions does that bring to mind? And again, we don't have a large group here, so probably won't have a ton of questions, but feel free to drop questions that prompt brings to mind into the chat.
So the first question that comes to my mind is best practices for whom and where? I mean, best practices is something very general, I feel.
Okay, so I put that into the chat. What other questions might be generated here? Feel free to unmute or type them in. I might say, what do we mean by professional educator?
Also, Chrysanthi wanted to add something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, what kind of skill does a professional educator have?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So again, if we had a larger group, we would very likely generate a lot of questions, and the question formulation technique does require, you know, a fair amount of people. I was hoping we had about 25 or 30 in the room here. So the idea with the QFT is to present a focus, a question focus, a statement, a prompt, could be a video, could be a picture, any of those kinds of things that will help generate questions. And what it does is shift from the teacher question as the prompt to a statement, and then students generating those questions, right? And so can you do these kinds of things with your students? Of course, but also can you do them in staff meetings and in sort of department meetings and other ways to sort of generate some of these questions, right? So what are some of a lot of times we think about, like, what are some of the tensions that one might be dealing with? Sometimes we think about the tension between knowledge and inquiry. and getting your colleagues to generate questions, and then using those as a way to sort of follow up and discuss, like, let's talk about these, let's think through some of these questions. What do we mean by that? What does that mean? What do we mean by inquiry or knowledge, or those kinds of things? And so just a few notes about, like, a question focus generally has a clear focus. It's not a question. We want it to provoke new lines of thinking and doesn't reveal bias. Lots of times it'll have a word or language that is sort of, again, sort of really provocative, makes you sort of take a side, something like this. And this is an example from the Right Question Institute folks. So the scientific method must be followed, right? You can generate some questions off of that. Or here in the States, we have rights when you're arrested called Miranda rights, right? You have the right to be silent and right to an attorney and those kinds of things. Miranda rights always protects the rights of the accused, right? And so we want to think about what are the structures intentionally we can put into our work between each other as professionals, and what are the ways in which we can foster this sort of sense of inquiry. Again, I think that those can be really, really rewarding intellectually. We think about how do we attract and retain teachers and help them do great work. Certainly lots of other things that are part of the puzzle, but giving them an opportunity to share and think and sort of play with ideas, I think is really, really important. The other steps, I'll just kind of go through the steps of the QFT just so you can see them. So we'd mark questions as either open-ended or closed-ended, discuss the advantages, when or why would you use one over the other, maybe ask students to change one open-ended to a closed-ended, one closed-ended to an open-ended, then prioritize. And we use this in our workshops when we're doing project-based learning work to say, all right, how do we figure out and come up with need to know questions to answer our driving questions? So that is something. Then we harvest the top 3 questions and kind of go around the room to surface some of the bigger, more important questions. And again, you certainly can do this with staff. And then what are the things that you might reflect on, the priorities and the rationale, the criteria that you use? So the question formulation technique is just one of many different things that we advocate for with students. And again, I think can be really, really powerful and important in work with, could be tools that you could work with staff to sort of improve that teacher well-being. Just a couple other things that I wanted to share here. One of the things that we are trying to develop is, I think, what we call the ThoughtStretchers Community, certainly based on inquiry. And here in the States, at least, we have some, quite a bit of friction in between lots of stakeholders in the education community. Some of those things are on some of the culture war issues, but some of them certainly are on pedagogy. One of the big pieces that we've talked about on our podcast is the reading wars and reading instruction. Again, I don't know how much of that is present in other places outside of the States, but that's been a big topic here. And a lot of energy and conflict. Another is around direct instruction versus, like project-based learning, more progressive kinds of education. And then also certainly some culture war kinds of things. So our ThoughtStretchers community is something we're hoping to launch soon. We're sort of collecting interest and sort of setting the stage to be able to provide a place for teachers interested in a little bit more complexity and nuance. What we try to lean into is what here in the States, we have an author named Jonathan Rauch, and I love his books and his work on what is called liberal science. Just very quickly, thinking about the fallibilist rules of how do we come up with knowledge, how do we figure out what is true and what is not true. The empirical rule where no person has a personal authority, that things are sort of subject to check by the system and by the social network, as it were. Sort of 10 commitments of liberal science that we really try to lean into. Again, you can see all these things on the website that I had up there, but really trying to kind of get into and think about how we develop students and actually teachers that are in pursuit of intellectual humility and curiosity and the things that inquiry can bring. And also, I think, as I said a few times here, sort of foster that sort of teacher well-being, and not developing that dogmatic ideologue kind of mindset, but people who are really interested in ideas, and the ideas what we call objective pluralism, and making sure that we are really trying to find and allow for lots of viewpoints and lots of curiosity and lots of inquiry, and teaching students not what to think, but how to think. So I think that's about it for us. I could certainly share some other things that we do in our work with students, and how we think about that. But hopefully that's been helpful. I'm happy to stick around with any questions.
Drew,
Again,
can I ask some clarification on that community you guys are putting together? Is it only for the States, or it's open for people around the world?
No, that's a really good question. So it's open to anybody. At this point, we haven't launched it yet. We're in the process of trying to figure out, set it up. Most of the work that we do is in the States, but we do work internationally. I've been in Germany. We've worked with school in Pakistan, South America, all over the place. And so any teachers that are sort of interested in more, no, we haven't worked. I have been in Greece, but I haven't worked with a school in Greece that I'm remembering now. I'm thinking maybe I have, but I've lost track, but I don't think so specifically in Greece. We've worked with schools in India, usually online. We've done some of these kinds of sessions, and other ways in which we work with schools online. We have not been to India yet at this point. Not to say that we wouldn't, but no, the community is really meant for anybody who is interested in sort of engaging in conversations and material and resources. We're envisioning sort of events kind of like this, maybe blog pieces, some maybe in person, those things that are really trying, those folks who are interested in more complexity and nuanced take on some of the more contentious issues. You might see some things on there that you really very much disagree with, and trying to foster discussion around those kinds of things in a way that will be productive and not sort of us versus them and those kinds of things. Thank you for that question.
Great. So we'll be following you on social media and ThoughtStretchers Education as well, to wait for you launching the community.
Yeah. It'll if you go to wegrowteachers.com, you can sign up for our newsletter, which is you can find that at several different places on the website. We also will have on the ThoughtStretchers site, that page exactly. You can certainly sign up for. There's a separate newsletter that will be for that will, like when we launch it, it will definitely go to those folks out there. Here's the ThoughtStretcher Twitter. You can certainly find, X. You can certainly find us on Facebook and those kinds of things. I'm going to put also the link to the ThoughtStretchers page, and what you'll see, it says sign up. And if you click the sign up, it will be a different email list that is specifically for that community. Again, we're trying to figure out how to best set that up to make it work the best, and it'll probably take a little tinkering with fiddling with the knobs and the buttons, trying to figure out what works best for folks. But we're hoping to launch it very, very soon.
Lovely. So if there are no other questions, I'd like to thank you, Drew, for this very interesting presentation and the very thought-provoking practices and ideas you shared with us. We will make sure that we will share all the links that were shared in this workshop in the description of the recording of this event. I don't know if there's anything else that the audience or you would like to add.
I would only say thank you for inviting me, and I appreciate the opportunity. For anybody who's watching, especially on a recording, feel free to reach out. WeGrowTeachers.com, Drew at ThoughtStretchers.org. We offer lots of different kinds of professional development. Again, all of it's focused through the lens of inquiry. I'd be happy to help or talk with you about how we might help you.
Perfect. Thank you very much, guys, for joining us. We'll see you at the next one. Goodbye.
Thank you.